Hi, this is John Romano, and this lecture is entitled The Emergence of Japan, and it's for my World Civilization class. As we begin our discussion of Japan, we should first start with some of the earliest history we have from Japan, which, I'm sorry to tell you, is still fairly mysterious, and we do not know a great deal about it, although it's something that's of great fascination for the modern Japanese themselves, what their origins are, even though that the amount of evidence is fairly limited. So far as we can tell, it appears that the early inhabitants of Japan were nomadic peoples who came from areas in northeastern Asia, they especially the areas of what is modern-day Korea. And it's possible that these people traveled across land bridges that existed in the Ice Age. Some of these people who initially traveled to Japan, were people who were Paleolithic hunters and gatherers. And we really wish we could say more about people at this phase of Japanese history. But these hunters and gatherers, the only things that they really leave behind for us are things like this, stone tools. And in fact, we don't actually even have skeletal remains for people at this time period. It was likely during this period that some of these hunters and gatherers who came into Japan would begin to hunt and, in fact, so successfully hunt large mammals that they wiped them out entirely. So, for instance, in this modern diorama, this may give you a rough idea of how this process worked, with early hunters attacking the mammals that still existed in Japan at the time, including, as you can see here, elephants. The development of the next period, really one of the first periods we begin to have slightly more evidence for, is in the next period we'll discuss, is known as the Jomon period. One of the things that we're lucky to have in this period for the Jomon is some of the oldest pottery that we have from Japan. And in fact, this entire period is named after the kind of rope-like pattern that you see on some of this earliest form of Japanese poetry, or Japanese pottery. Here's some of the slightly more elaborate version of the same kind of pottery. There's another example as well, and even sort of wilder version of this kind of pottery from the Jomon period. Naturally, historians have always been even slightly more interested by the kind of figurines that some people in the Jomon period made. Here's one example, and here's another sitting example of someone who clearly looks like a human being, and in fact these may well represent real human beings, but then again we can't say that with any degree of certainty. It is possible that these are gods or spirits that people worshipped, but without any written documents, we really can't do much to establish their identity. We think that in the Jomon period, this was a relatively small-scale society, and this is just a modern reproduction of what some of the areas in the Jomon period looked like, where you see these sort of very simple, these very simple sort of settlements. In some cases, people living in pits. They had thatched roofs over their small houses. We can also say, based upon some of the archaeological digs from this period, that some of these people in the Japanese Jomon period ate mussels. That is the kind of mussels one finds in the sea. And we have found some shells for mussels in these settlements. The next period, and a period that in some ways was what was really a much larger break than what had gone before it, is something that's known as the Yayoi Revolution. And what we really see in this period is, again, a period of great immigration into Japan. Again, likely coming from the Korean Peninsula. And these later migrants didn't come all in one period. We'll notice that they use the term revolution, but this is a slow, drawn-out revolution that took place over centuries. By this point, there is no more ice bridge that connects Korea with Japan, and so we imagine that these new migrants came into Japan by oared boats. The term itself, Yayoi, that we use to refer to this historical period, is actually a place name in the modern-day city of Tokyo. And it's in Tokyo where they found this kind of pale orange form of pottery. And we think that during this period, several new introductions to Japanese civilization come with these newcomers, these people who are coming to Japan. For instance, very importantly for feeding people, the cultivation of rice begins. We also see on top of that the ability of people to work both bronze and iron, like this example here, come in as a result of the new migrants. We also think that they bring with them horses into Japan. Here's another example of the kind of ability of people in the Yayoi Revolution to work with metal. Most people tend to think that this wave of migration was not a peaceful one. And in fact, these are arrowheads, just some of the weapons that were likely used in this period. We think that it appears to us that some of these newcomers during the Yayoi Revolution forcibly and violently pushed out some of the people who already were in Japan at the time. And in particular, it appears that the newcomers quite logically decided to settle on places in both in the central and southern islands of Japan, and the places where they would find the mildest climate, and of course with the aim of doing agriculture was the reason. And we think that especially things like these kind of arrowheads, both made in bronze and iron, are evidence to us that there were battles for this land. The natives who were already there recognized that this territory was the best agricultural land. And we do think that initially there's very little sign that these different sort of new settlements that are being founded by these migrants were really very strongly unified together. We probably saw a patchwork of small territories as these new people enter in. We think that even from this very early period in Japan, although really getting much worse as time goes on, we think that it is going to prove to be a very consistent problem to really feed the population of Japan. In fact, for the amount of territory in Japan, there's almost always going to be a disproportionately large population. And this can be, the feeding of these peoples was done with rice, as we've said, also fishing, but it was always a challenge. As the population begins to grow after these migrations, what we begin to see is that there's a settled agricultural society that begins to form. And this is, again, just a mock-up, a modern mock-up of what one of these might have looked like. We'll see now much better defined aristocratic families beginning to rise to power and forming some very simple, small states around them, with not really much in the way of government, but with a very clear sense of who was meant to lead these things, leaders of the families. This, inasmuch as there was a system or interaction among these different families who were dominant throughout Japan, they're really held together by someone known as an emperor. Now, we of course have encountered emperors in several different civilizations that we've seen at this point, certainly in places like Rome during the Empire and Imperial China. We had said that the emperor is, politically speaking, an extremely strong figure. And so it really comes as something of a shock to discover that in Japan there is a person who is referred to as an emperor, but one thing he does not have, unlike some counterparts in other places, is all that much power. We do see that there are certainly all sorts of pious statements about the so-called supremacy of the emperor. We see, too, these religious statements that, in fact, the emperor could trace his ancestry back to the sun goddess. So there's a divine connection that gives him all this power. But the strange part, again, at least in comparison with other civilizations around the same time, was that the emperor, for the most part of his history, has been a ceremonial figurehead and a symbol of authority without the ability to do all that much. Paradoxically, this is actually one of the keys to longevity of the Japanese emperor. Because this Japanese emperor did not have a huge amount of power, he really was not deposed during any times of turmoil. There really was very little point to getting rid of the emperor if he could not exercise much power on the ground. We think that in time, Japan begins to fall under the spell or the influence of its great Western neighbor, China, Imperial China. And this is especially starting in the 8th century with something that is known as the Heon Period. And this really was a conscious decision by at least some in Japan to try to reform their way of life, their civilization, to renew it by seeking out the guidance of Imperial China. And so we know, for instance, that one of the things that at least some of the Japanese do is seek out some of the religious traditions that were popular in China, Confucianism, which, as we said, was perhaps more of a philosophical than a religious system, and certainly also Buddhism, as I get some sense of here from this statue of the Buddha. We even see that one family in particular, the Fujiwara, actually begins to make all sorts of administrative changes based upon the Chinese example. For instance, beginning to follow the Chinese calendar, having a fixed capital city, whereas previously there really had not been as many capital cities. Most leaders of clans would be mobile for most of the time. As we'll see later on as well, we see Chinese writings begin to be brought to Japan. These characters in modified form would end up really providing for a written form of the native Japanese language. imports too, things like silk, wine, pottery, some of these great sort of luxury items that China was known to be able to produce also find their way into Japan. That one family I mentioned to her, the Fujiwara, actually become so enthusiastic with these many imports they're taking from China that they, in fact, wanted to centralize Japanese politics on the model of imperial China. So, for instance, establishing one law court in all Japan and having an emperor who had the mandate of heaven, the Chinese mandate of heaven. Now, the Japanese would refer to this idea with the Japanese term tenno, which means heavenly emperor. But although the name is different, the idea of the mandate of heaven that was already sort of circulating around because of the model of imperial China would really be replicated. And we see that this clan will actually begin to create officials just like in imperial China. They would, for instance, collect taxes, keep records, have a police system. We do think, though, that they're immediately, upon these attempts to reform, they begin in Japan to recognize some of its limitations. We think that these officials simply were not as well educated as those in China. They did not have a functional examination system the way that they did in China. And in effect, most of these jobs officials simply went to members of one's family. I should say, too, that in Japan, there was also an attempt at creating something like an equal field system that we had said that was experimented with one point in imperial China, but this was poorly implemented, and really it failed quite soon after it was started. In the end, then, this one attempt during this period of Japanese history to create a centralized monarchy would end up being a failure. And in fact, we, in some sense, see the exact opposite trend happening in Japan. Not centralization, but in fact, more even increasing disunity. And by the time we get between the late 12th and to the 14th century in Japan, real power actually falls to the hands of a group of military dictators or warlords that they name the Japanese term shogun. The shoguns would rule what some people have referred to as a tent government. And by that, what they mean is that they did not have a capital city, they didn't have a court. These rulers simply ruled on the battlefield out of their tents, as if they were ready to go to battle at any moment. And in effect, under the shoguns, what we'll see is that personal contacts are really what is far more important than any kind of standardized government. And we think that these shoguns will claim that their authority comes from the emperor, but in reality they rule without much say from the emperor at all. And in effect, the emperors really, in some sense, they just by practical necessity, they had to agree with powerful shoguns' decree, or else the shoguns could withdraw military support from the emperor. And in effect, these shoguns don't even rule from the same place where the emperor is at any given moment. They have their own centers of power. When we look at this sort of very interesting decentralization of power in Japan, at least some people have thought that the reason for this is the topography in Japan. Japan is really made up of a whole patchwork of different remote valleys and mountains, and we think that for really a long-standing period, nobles at the local level had been able to use this topography then to have a very strong control over their local regions, to tax people, and to really control very tightly who got to be considered a noble and who didn't. Essentially, by blood, this was determined. So there was really no means to climb beyond one station. And we really think that this very interesting situation in which Japan lacked a strong central government was in some sense a luxury that the Japanese could afford because they lived on an island state. And what this meant was there were substantial obstacles to invading Japan. And in fact, no foreign intruder really is going to be more than occasionally threatening during the period that we're discussing here. And so there is really no need for a national army because there's no threat big enough to require it. And really, one could, in looking forward to the future, one could say that Japan would, even a much later period, would not be successfully invaded, although, of course, the United States really got close to that in 1945. Altogether, what this really meant is that there's no serious external threat to national integrity. And really, in some ways, we see the Japanese will decide for themselves to what degree they want contact with even their great neighbor, China. Over the long period we're talking about today, there are some periods of time in which we know that many Japanese were still interested in China, and especially, for instance, traders would go, diplomats would travel over to Japan, where there were people who just wanted to learn more about Chinese culture who would. But we also see that in sometimes people who were traders will quickly become raiders when the Imperial China is at weak points. And in fact, then these same people would become pirates and sometimes prey upon Chinese goods. And we really see that this decentralized government meant that the Japanese are not making any serious attempt at curbing piracy. In fact, they're allowing it to happen for the most part. The one very interesting exception to this rule, in which the Japanese were really very close to getting invaded, comes during the peoples we had spoken of during our last lecture, the Mongols. It was the Mongols' belief that at one time or another, the entire world would fall under their empire. And since Japan, of course, is in the world, they were determined to take Japan as well. And so we see that the Mongols will make two very serious attempts at invading the Japanese, and to forcing the Japanese to recognize their claim to their empire, and to force the Japanese to send over tribute. We know that the Mongols send over some scouting parties, and there were some initial battles, but the two very large Mongol invasions planned for 1274 and 1281 were both met by failure. In effect, this really, to some degree, this is because the Mongols' inexperience at fighting naval battles and traveling by sea. But the second of these two attempted invasions really had a very much more interesting sort of cause for its failure. During the attempted invasion of 1281, these things that the Japanese will refer to as kamikaze, a term that means divine winds, would come about. And as modern secular historians, what seems simply happened was a huge storm would kick up, would destroy virtually the entire Mongol navy, and this would really convince the Mongols that the invasion of Japan simply was not worth it. Of course, for the Japanese themselves, this was more than just a happy accident. They really believed that some of the nature spirits had protected them. And so the term kamikaze, divine winds, interestingly enough, has a very positive valuation in earlier Japanese history. And so it's not until World War II that the term then is transformed to refer to these kind of suicide bombers, and so really lose the kind of sheen it once had. Now, you might think that this brush with death would have changed this sort of decentralization of power. And interestingly enough, there is a period of time in which, later on, in which the shoguns will lose their power. And this is a time of considerable confusion, even for Japanese politics at this point. We would think that there's actually even some voices in Japan who want the emperor to gain real power as the only one to bring an end to the sort of political chaos that existed. But in effect, after the smoke clears, neither the shoguns nor the emperor will enjoy power any longer. And instead, what we begin to see until really the end of the 16th century is a time of civil war that is really almost continuous in Japan. Anything like the old sort of Chinese-style bureaucracy in court was completely gone. Instead, what you begin to see now is a series of small-scale nobles and their families who ruled throughout Japan. And, of course, to have a civil war, to fight against your neighbors, what you need are foot soldiers. And this is the era in which we see the sort of world-famous samurai rising to power. Samurai comes, the term comes from a Japanese word meaning to serve. Theoretically, at least, these samurai were the servants of all of these noble clans. Here's just some armor of a samurai. The samurai were mounted warriors, and really they are the ones playing the key role in the political and military life in medieval Japan. The samurai did not have day jobs. Their job they were professional warriors. They were specialists in the arts of fighting. As you can see, on horseback, bows and arrows. Some of them also were masters of martial arts. They're also very good at hunting. Now, I said to you earlier that it's really just, in some sense, a falsehood to say that the samurai were really servants, because although they did take their money from these sort of noble lords, we really think that the samurai end up actually eating up a good portion of the agricultural surplus of Japan at this point. They had to be constantly funded if these different nobles were either to fight offensively against other nobles, or defensively to manage to hold on to their own land. And if your family was foolish enough to go out without the service of samurai, you're really going to find yourself without land very quickly. Although certainly in later times the samurai would be seen sometimes as these kind of noble warriors, really some people viewed them as parasites who lived off this perpetual civil war. Really, they had no desire for the civil war to stop, because it was through the funding of these different nobles that they were able to continue to do what they did. So at least on the ground, they certainly did not look as honorable as sometimes in later times they've been portrayed as being. Now, none of these kind of political or military troubles, however, should really lead you into thinking that Japanese social and cultural life would ever ground to a halt. And in fact, that both social and cultural life would have some very interesting achievements. In some ways, although there are times in which the Japanese will borrow from outsiders, most especially Imperial China, we do think that the Japanese will end up having a very particular culture, a very sort of unique culture. And in part of that, we really think is because, in some part, being an island, they were separated from others, and perhaps as a result of this, were able to maintain a good deal of their own civilizational integrity. Here, of course, I'm only going to mark a few highlights of this. Someone could write an entire book on this, or they have already, of course. One of the things that is very obvious to us about Japanese civilization is that the idea of having social unity is important. And the keys to this unity were family and traditional religion. Some people would say, in effect, that the clan, the sort of large family which people belong to, was one of the extremely sort of important sort of foundational elements in Japanese society, and Japan as a whole was viewed basically, at least in ideal form, as this sort of huge super family overall. The emperor, in some sense, you could think of him as being kind of a father, a clan leader over the entire Japan. The emperor presided in this role over the traditional cult of Japan. And it's worthwhile to spend a few words on this, because this religion is somewhat different from others, this other sort of world religions that we've discussed in this class. The traditional native religion of Japan is known as Shinto, which is sometimes translated as the way of the gods. In Shinto, and you get some idea from this one image, Shinto really stresses the veneration of nature, which is embodied in certain features of nature. For example, trees, waterfalls, mountains. Certain deceased leaders should be venerated. And above all the things in nature, perhaps most important is the sun. Most people tend to think that Shinto probably enters Japan during the time of the Yayoi Revolution. Now, unlike many of the religions that we've discussed in greater length here, Shinto certainly does uphold certain values, and it does provide us some views on the way the universe runs, but what it does not have, what we'd anticipate perhaps for those people who come from a Christian tradition, is that it does not have a fixed form of doctrine, doesn't have a standard series of scriptures, we cannot tell who the founder of this religion is. And in fact, this is not something that really necessarily bothered practitioners of Shinto. None of these things that did not have. And really what they would say is that the key to Shinto is ritual. That people in Shinto have to do worship both in their family and then in shrines like this one here, which is one of the most important Shinto shrines. And within these kind of shrines, one would have to do rites of purification and a series of bowing, clapping, praying, and leaving offerings for these nature gods or for certain ancestors. So it did tie one in more deeply with a broader supernatural world by doing these things. I'm showing you here again what's fascinating about some of these Shinto shrines is that, as you'll see here, they are built in wood. And so, although this is the spot in which this particular Shinto shrine has now existed for an enormous amount of time, for centuries, it is not the same exact building in as much as it's made of wood, so it has to be replaced. Here's another Shinto shrine. And so there was no problem as far as believers in Shinto thought in rebuilding a shrine, making use of new wood, and just rebuilding it from scratch in the same fashion. It was still viewed as essentially the same shrine, although it was rebuilt. We can see at the same time that there are other religious developments that occur in Japan. And one of, as I mentioned to you earlier, one of the religious strands that ends up becoming borrowed specifically from China is Buddhism. And as all of you will remember, of course, Buddhism is not a tradition that originates with China, but by the point in which Japan becomes interested in it, Buddhism had been circulating in China so long that it was not really thought of as a foreign tradition at all. What's interesting is that when Buddhism starts to circulate in Japan, it ends up taking new forms that did not necessarily exist in the rest of the Buddhist world. So a number of leaders within these, which in Japanese Buddhism, begin to preach a reform form of Buddhism that's sometimes referred to as Pure Land Buddhism. What Pure Land Buddhism taught is that the world as we know it has fallen on hard times. And one can look around you and see that we're being punished by disasters, which was not hard to do in Japan, given certainly militarily speaking, just how much war they encountered. The only way that you, as a believer, could react to the difficult situation in our world is to have honest faith in the Buddha, who was said to live in a sort of a state of paradise, which they refer to as the Pure Land. One of the reasons why this Buddhism in particular is different from Buddhists elsewhere is that we had said that in Buddhism, Buddhist monks really normally would play a central role in learning, in doing ritual, in doing constant meditation with an aim of attempting to gain nirvana. What we see instead in Pure Land Buddhism was that monks do not play a central role at all. We instead see people who are peasants, poor, humble people, and rather than living in monasteries, they would get together in little congregations, and they would have gatherings, but not gatherings really that just focused on very quiet meditation. The gatherings of Pure Land Buddhists were very emotional, kind of like tent revivals. They would, there would be a lot of, for instance, a lot of chanting involved. They still had the goal of spiritually transforming themselves, but not necessarily through just in constant study and meditation in the same way as Buddhist monks. Another thing that would have been very different from mainstream Buddhism at the time is that and sometimes in these small gatherings of Pure Land Buddhists, these gatherings actually would, believe it or not, break out into violence when people begin to identify some of the problems in their own time, and sometimes they, in an activist way, would actually seek to master these situations or turn them around. So, for instance, attacking samurai. Some of the people who were identified as people who were helping to perpetuate the state of war. A second form of Buddhism that really begins in Japan is something known as Zen Buddhism. If there's something similar between the two Japanese forms of Buddhism, it is that Zen Buddhists also would reject the kind of traditional monastic devotions that were known throughout the rest of the Buddhist world. And one of the things that they said, for instance, is that rather than this sort of lifelong, sort of years-long path of meditation to achieve nirvana that most Buddhist monks would have to face, Zen Buddhists taught, for instance, that enlightenment, nirvana, could actually be achieved in one single burst of enlightenment, much less of a long, slow process. So, for instance, they taught a story about how one monk was supposed to have achieved enlightenment by just watching the opening of peach blossoms in the spring. As long as you were in a state where you could clear your mind, this sort of achieve this form of learned ignorance, then you could manage to get enlightenment, but it may happen much more quickly than not. One interesting thing, too, about Zen Buddhism is that there is constantly a preference for the individual taking part in this rather than the congregation, whereas most Buddhist monks would come together in large groups. Zen Buddhists, however, unlike a Pure Land Buddhist, were not known for their strong emotion. And rather than fighting against samurai, in fact, some of the practitioners of Zen Buddhism were actually samurai, which actually worked quite well with their way of life, because samurai sometimes had to travel. They couldn't always predict being around other believers. So because Zen Buddhism already was stressing individuality, then it didn't really matter whether or not they could be together with other believers to practice their faith. Another thing that we had mentioned that's very interesting about Japan this period, although we can only go into very briefly, is some of its broader culture. And as I had mentioned to you earlier, especially when it comes to the Heon period, what we see first is that much of the early literature that would emerge from Japan would really closely imitate Chinese models. And in fact, although it may appear odd, some of the earliest literature that we have from Japan it does not only follow Chinese models, but it actually uses the Chinese language that was thought to be the literary language. And so people would use Chinese rather than Japanese to write. And we're going to, for those of the people who do study the development of languages, they've determined that Japanese writing will actually reflect a great deal of Chinese influence. So, for instance, they will at times, for instance, borrow Chinese characters and then apply them to Japanese words. And so as a result, it really does take a long time to really develop a truly Japanese literature that is independent of their Chinese models. The beginnings of something independent really occur with Japanese poetry, which takes on forms that did not exist in China. Poetry in Japan was thought especially to be something that was prized among nobles. And it was supposed to reflect the breeding and the high moral character that nobles were supposed to have for themselves. And the general principle is that in Japanese poetry is that less is more. And the aim of a lot of Japanese poetry was to create a specific mood by focusing on one single subject. For instance, focusing in on things in nature. And any of you who have studied in other contexts, the haiku, have some sense of what this kind of poetry is all about. Now, all these trends we've been talking about in Japanese literature were largely confined to men who really were the ones who had the ability to have access to this sort of high-level learning that were either allowed to learn Chinese or to write this kind of poetry. But Japanese women rarely received any kind of higher education. And so if aristocratic women wish to compose, they really had no choice but to write in Japanese and to write from their experience. And of the many literary works in Japanese history, perhaps none is more interesting than what is known as the Tale of Genji, written by this noble woman pictured here, known as Murasaki Shikobu. The Tale of Genji is considered by many to be the first novel, appearing at around the year 1000, far before any Western novels. The world's first novel, it is also one of the longest and most complicated. The Tale of Genji in the modern printed edition runs to 2,500 pages and has around 430 different characters to keep track of. And it really, in some ways, Shikobu's work reflects her own experience at one of these Chinese-style courts when they were experimenting with Chinese-style courts in Japan. Altogether, we think that this is a very sophisticated work, and it talks about the fictitious imperial prince who is known as Genji. And in the early goings-on, Genji lives amid gardens and palaces, and Genji and his friends devote themselves to this very refined form of lifestyle, doing things like mixing perfumes for fun, composing verses, hitting on women. And if the whole work had remained like this, it probably would have become dull at some point. But as the book goes on and Genji gets old, he begins to reflect on how time passes. And that in effect, especially for people who are sensitive, you will end up experiencing sorrow in life. And that you'll begin to see that the past joys and relationship you had in your life can no longer be recovered. So ultimately, a very sort of melancholy spirit wins out in this work. I should say, though, especially as the life of the Japanese court becomes far less important, and Japan really becomes more geared for war, this is actually reflected, too, in the literary tastes of people. And so the tales begin to come out instead of heroic battles and the military exploits of warriors. This too would be combined with a deeper sense of sadness and loneliness, but it would mean that at least for a while there wouldn't be as much a taste for this sort of court-centered tales like the tale of Genji. Great. Thank you for your attention.